So without further ado, Dr. Iffy, would you like to kick off our event today?
Thank you, Lydia. Your Excellency, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to everybody. My name is Dr. Iffy Ofong. I'm the main representative to the United Nations for Worldwide Network Nigeria Women in Development and Environment. I also sit on the executive committee for the NGO working group to end homelessness. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this very important parallel event, which we have titled Inclusive Policies to Achieve Gender Equality, Women Empowerment to End Homelessness. This event is sponsored by the Permanent Mission of Ireland to the United Nations, the NGO Working Group to End Homelessness, and NGO Committee for Social Development. Other co-sponsors include Unanima International, Institute for Global Homelessness of DePaul University, Chicago, Worldwide Network Nigeria, ATD Fourth World, Association for Charities, NGO Committee on Migration, Habitat International Coalition, Mercy International, and Soroptimist International. Your Excellency, this NGO working group to end homelessness is made up of UN ECOSOC NGOs and also individuals who are advocating at the United Nations and international spaces for the human rights to adequate housing for all and the right to land in order to end homelessness. Our vision actually is a future in which every person will experience the dignity of having a safe, habitable, affordable, and secure home. We envision a future where human rights for all is safeguarded. And in addition, supportive policies and programs that will end homelessness among women in all the regions of the world. Your Excellency, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we will all recall the commitments made to address poverty among women in the Beijing Platform for Action. Now we are 30 years after that adoption. Women and girls continue to be disproportionately vulnerable, and they are experiencing extreme poverty and homelessness. They continue to find themselves in insecure, undignified, and unsafe conditions. This, again, is due largely to discrimination and entrenched gender inequalities, which have denied women their right to land, as well as access to adequate housing and support. So today's event, therefore, will explore how social policies can address the intersection of homelessness and feminization of poverty. Our speakers would, in addition, discuss the gaps and challenges in implementing the Beijing Platform for Action to achieve gender equality, women empowerment, and to end homelessness among women. Furthermore, our speakers would explore if the exclusion of women from institutions of power and governance has any impact on the state of homelessness among women. Now, to ensure that we all stay on course and deliver on today's event, is our able Lydia Stazen. Lydia is the Executive Director at the Institute for Global Homelessness, where she works with local and national governments and other stakeholders to implement evidence-based practices to prevent, reduce, and end homelessness. More importantly, Lydia is the co-chair of this NGO working group to end homelessness. Lydia, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Iffy. I'm really delighted to be with all of you today and to be moderating this webinar as a parallel event to the Commission on the Status of Women. It's a really it's a topic that is really close to my heart. I remember being a little girl when Hillary Clinton really famously said, women's rights are human's rights and human rights are women's rights. And this year's commission is the 30th anniversary of that statement. And I've spent the last 10 years of my career working on homelessness, but the first 10 years of my career, I worked on women's equality and gender equity. And so to be able to be here today talking about both of these causes that are so dear to my heart and that have shaped my career is a really special moment. Those of us who work at this intersection know that women and girls are a special population. They can experience multiple different types of homelessness. They do experience street homelessness. They experience homelessness in shelters and in temporary accommodation, and they experience hidden homelessness. Mamas will often do anything they can do to keep their kids from being on the street. And so they're living in overcrowded situations. They're living in very tenuous and insecure situations. They're doing the best they can to keep their kids and themselves from off the street and from out of the shelters. And the issue with that then is they don't necessarily get connected to the types of housing and the types of services that they may need in order to secure stable housing for themselves and their families. So it's a hidden type of homelessness in many situations, and it's one that deserves more attention, more awareness, and more programs and services to support them. We know that women and girls have particular needs that need to be addressed. How do you stay hygienic in these situations when you're menstruating? And there's also increased risk for sexual exploitation and abuse. So again, really just thinking through how women and girls need particular forms of attention and support and trauma-informed care to move out of these really precarious situations and set themselves and their children up for the best life possible. So we are going to get into all of that with our incredible speakers who are with us today. I really do want to particularly thank Ambassador Cronin for being here with us today. The Permanent Mission of Ireland to the United Nations has been a huge support and a huge champion on this work that we've done collectively over the past several years on homelessness. So again, we do appreciate not only that support and leadership, but also to have you being here with us today. And so I would like to hand over the floor to you. And we really are delighted to hear whatever comments you have for us today.
Thank you very much, Lydia, and greetings to everyone. You said there's fabulous speakers to come, and they are coming. It's not me. I'm here also to listen. Well, we are so, as Ireland, so happy to be part of this very important discussion. And thank you, Unanima, and of course, our dear friend, Sister Jean Quinn, for convening this. And thank you, Lydia. And your organization, the NGO Working Group also to End Homelessness. Dr. Iffy, great to hear from you at the start. The NGO Committee for Social Development, the NGO Committee on Migration, as co-sponsors of this event. Thank you. for the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, engagement at the multilateral space here, the UN in New York and elsewhere. It's very important, and we really stand behind you in it. This year, of course, as we know, is the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And we only have 5 years left to achieve the SDGs. So it's a tall mountain to climb, but every effort is worth it, and we need to reinvigorate all of those efforts. Progress on gender equality, we know, remains far, far too slow. That's very clear. The CSW this week, by the way, we managed to agree a political declaration, which wasn't easy in the current environment, but it's there. It recognizes that women and girls are at greater risk of poverty, and that's an important statement. The declaration, which was negotiated by member states, commits us all to eradicating extreme poverty, commits us to eradicating multidimensional and intergenerational poverty. They're important terms. And it also explicitly references the feminization of poverty. And that is key as well, because underneath that is the understanding that there are power and gender imbalances that need to be corrected. And even aside from the barriers that women and girls face on a day-to-day basis with regards to education, they're likely to earn less, they own fewer assets over the course of their lifetime. These are compounding challenges. That's not by chance, by the way. As we all know, this is a result of structural and systemic barriers at play, including negative cultural norms, gender bias in law and policy making. So each of us member states of the UN have a job to do, Ireland included, and our Minister of Health, who delivered our national statement at CSW yesterday, very ably illustrated that Ireland has work to do as well. Nobody can stand here and preach to others when we all have work to do, each and every one of us. But of course, we also know that there are some contexts where women are extremely vulnerable and which really need support and policy and a lot of engagement. I wanted to say also that recognizing the many intersecting factors that we're looking at in terms of homelessness, gender inequality, poverty, and the resultant displacement, gender-based violence being a key aspect, and housing availability, that these aggravating factors arising out of gender equality and that are leading to further gender inequality need quite a lot of clear thinking. And that's why we do recommend and highly commend the research that has emanated from your organizations and groups, and that feeds into the decision making and policy making. One area that Ireland is trying to alleviate situations where women are finding themselves in abusive relationships or situations is through our overseas development program. For example, in Kenya, we're very proud of partnering with UN Women and OHCHR to support shelters for women who need to leave their homes due to physical or sexual violence that they experience. I myself worked in Uganda in our program there, where likewise Busogo in the east of Uganda and elsewhere, we worked very hard with the police, with community organizations, also with the church, who have an important role to play here as well, in terms of putting in place systems and structures to deal with gender-based violence. And that sometimes means providing temporary housing. And I saw myself through people that I've met in that work, how important that temporary housing is. It's a lifesaver, literally, for people. It needs investment. And quite often NGOs were providing such facilities. We were arguing that governments need to provide them as well. There needs to be more of them. People need to have somewhere, a safe haven in such circumstances. This all falls into our approach on social protection. That's a crucial instrument. Social protection in terms of reducing poverty, mitigating homelessness, promoting equality, economic activity, which in itself can have liberating aspects. And quite a large proportion of our efforts in our partner countries is based on that social protection approach. There is no solution, of course, to homelessness. There's no magic solution to homelessness, but there are solutions that are there. There are no magic solutions to ending gender inequality, but there are fundamental things that we need to do better on. And so we are very keen as an Irish government to work with you, our partners, and others in terms of trying to address that. And of course, the World Social Summit coming up later this year will be an opportunity for us to really bring much of this learning in and seeing how we can address it further through that outcome document and practically on the ground. So thanks very much again, and very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much again for being with us, for those comments. A couple things that you said that resonated with me. I was thinking as you talked about the feminization of poverty and the cuts to the overseas development programs that we're seeing. And I know that all of us participating on this call understand how those types of cuts are going to be impacting women and girls who are living in poverty in all of these different countries. And so I think in this context, our work has gotten a lot more challenging. And as you say, there's no magic solution, but there are common sense solutions. I was recently working with a foundation that was reviewing some different grant proposals, and they were commenting to me, oh, we want something innovative, something new and interesting. And I just reminded them it's housing and services that work to end homelessness. And so there's no silver bullet to this. It doesn't always feel exciting or innovative, but we do know what works, and that is housing and services that are tailored to the needs, specifically to people experiencing homelessness. So thank you again for being with us, and we look forward to a robust conversation. And for those of you who are on the call today listening in, we will have a pretty large chunk of our agenda dedicated to questions and answers. So if you would like to put those in the chat as we go along, put them into the question and answer box as we go along, we will be taking those questions and responding to them towards the end. I am now really pleased to introduce a dear colleague and one of the founders of the working group, Sister Jean Quinn, who is the Executive Director of Unanima International. Again, she has been a really core part of the working group to end homelessness since it was founding in 2017. Jean is a member of the International Congregation of the Daughters of Wisdom and comes out of the nursing profession. She also founded Sophia Housing in Ireland and has spent, a lot of her career working with people experiencing homelessness in Dublin, and particularly women. Her passion for peace, justice, and the integrity of creation flows through all of her work in international advocacy. And she also, I should mention as well, is the former chair of the NGO Committee for Social Development. So great to have you with us, Jean, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much, indeed. And I don't know what it feels like coming after Donal, an Irish voice, having another Irish voice that has a little bit of a croaky voice today. But thank you all for inviting me here today. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you're joining us today. And thank you for asking us to speak on the gaps and challenges in implementing the Beijing Platform for Action to achieve gender equality, women's empowerment, and ending homelessness among women. Now, like the UN, we tend to, on these events, have a long title. And so when I see a long title, I think that one needs unpacking. Firstly, I want to talk about the intersections between gender inequality, the feminization of poverty, women's right to land, adequate and affordable housing, women's empowerment, and the ending of homelessness among women and girls. And I think for all of us that are on this call today, many of us, we want to use the word homelessness. It has meaning, as does poverty, but unless we're actually using that word, we are not going to get an end to homelessness. Intersectionality is a term that we are hearing more of increasingly now, but really what does it mean? And what does it have to do with gender inequality? The term acknowledges that all forms of oppression are interwoven and refers to the ways in which systems of inequality, often based on factors such as gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, disability, and class, all intersect and result in patterns and practices that impact those communities. If we do not acknowledge intersectionality, our efforts to tackle inequality and injustices are in vain. Gender-based violence cannot be analysed in a vacuum without an intersectional lens. The Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action was the world's most comprehensive visionary plan ever created to achieve the equal rights of all women and girls. It was agreed by 189 governments in 1995 at the Fourth World Conference on Women. It took a global stand against gender-based violence with 1,583 laws passed against it, with 193 countries passing it, up from 12 countries in 1995. And this includes 354 statutes targeting domestic violence. However, within the contemporary global context, where efforts to advance gender equality are set against a deteriorating global landscape, where violent conflict, climate-related disasters, food, fuel, and financial crises continue to be part of our landscape. All of these crises have the most severe impacts on groups already facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, deepening poverty and homelessness, and inequality for those who have contributed least to such systems of harm, while concentrating wealth and power in the hands of the few. In 2020, the resolution on homelessness adopted by the Economic and Social Council reads, "Homelessness is a condition where a person or household lacks habitable space with security of tenure, rights, and ability to enjoy social relations, including safety." Under this definition, manifestations of homelessness, which are out of sight and therefore often overlooked, including living with abusers, such as situations of families experiencing domestic violence and trafficked or living in forced marriage. Many women looking to leave their living situations lack resources and access to affordable housing for themselves and their children. That's one of the biggest issues, actually. The 30th anniversary of the Beijing Conference presents an opportunity to revisit and expand the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action to accommodate new and emerging challenges with clearer links to the Sustainable Development Goals. According to the latest Sustainable Development Goals snapshot agenda, despite many achievements in 30 years, persistent challenges continue to hinder progress. Challenges related to inequality include child marriages, and we know that 1 in 5 girls worldwide is married before the age of 18. 1 in 3 women experience physical or sexual violence, primarily by an intimate partner. And femicide, on average, 140 women and girls are killed every day by a family member. Just think about that for a minute. The Beijing Action for Platform had 12 areas of action referred to as the critical areas of concern, where urgent action was needed to ensure greater equality. One area in particular was in relation to women and poverty. When women are poor and become homeless, their rights are not protected and they face many areas of discrimination, including their gender and economic situation, their health, which includes proper nutrition, sexual and reproductive rights, their mental health, freedom from violence, and also their families, children, communities, and economies suffers as well. Multiple crises have slowed progress on poverty eradication and homelessness. Women and girls remain among those at greatest risk of being in poverty and homelessness, or at risk of falling into it at some stage in their lives. The Beijing Platform for Action calls for gender equality to be integrated into the full range of social and economic policies to ensure access for all women to resources, opportunity, and public services. Having worked, as Lydia said, for many years, since 1987 in this homeless sector and as a practitioner, you see a multiplicity of issues, and we all know them, because sometimes I feel I come on here and we talk about all the areas of causes and concerns, but we need to begin to look at solutions. We're looking for actions, not words. So UNANIMA International members respond to homelessness and survivors of violence by providing safety, shelter, health, justice, and all other essential services. And I've had the privilege of going to many countries around the world and visiting those areas and seeing how they can contribute to solutions. What I believe is the part of the solution is facilitating women's empowerment beyond parity, which will require greater and more effective investment in social and resources that with support, engagement with and the participation of women, as they would say, don't talk about us without us. So our call to action is for expanding public investment in gender-responsive social protection and public services. We call for universal social protection, education and health systems that better respond to the needs of women and girls, including crises. We call for the harnessing of digitalization to improve access to social protection and public services and close both digital and service gaps. We call for better coordination of services, including the provision of health services for women and girls, including survivors of violence. We call especially for partnerships and collaboration to assist countries where large gender gaps and inequalities exist to promote socio-economic development. And these are serious calls to action. As always, though, I want to end with a message of hope. Despite the many challenges and uncertainties that remain for countries today, for women experience extreme poverty and homelessness, there is satisfaction to be drawn from the progress made and hope in the context of opportunities for gender equality that arise in many areas, especially digital and technological innovations. They present potential solutions which before were out of reach. So now is the time to make a difference in transforming lives of women and girls, to turn the vision and aspirations of the Beijing Platform for Action into reality. All of us need to be advocates, encouragers, and duty bearers, including those working in government, the private sector, and civil society, to prioritize recommitment, accountability, and resourcing during the assessment of the Beijing Platform for Action. And to quote Desmond Tutu, when asked by a journalist, "Why are you such an optimist?" he said, "No, I am not an optimist. I am a prisoner of hope." And that really is what is important for all of us, to be prisoners of hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Just a couple quick reflections on your comments, talking about the different intersections. You know, sometimes people say homelessness can happen to anyone. It really happens to people who are living at different intersections, whether that be an intersection of poverty and gender, poverty and disability, poverty and race, because we know that structural racism is a huge driver of homelessness as well. And it's part of what makes this such a challenging topic to solve, because not only do you have to calibrate what an individual person needs in that moment to reach stable housing, you also have to calibrate all these different things that are happening in society, from policies, from access to services, to housing stock. It's really, truly a complicated issue to solve at scale. The other piece that you mentioned that I think is important to draw out is it's not just the right thing to do to provide housing and services to women and girls living in poverty and homelessness, but it's also good business. Economies will grow stronger. There's been so much research about how when you invest in women and in girls, the return on that investment to society is measurable, and it is a strong one. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that as well. And then thank you for your reflections on hope. I think we can all use that reminder that we have to practice science fiction. We have to believe in the world that we want to create, and be hopeful that we can continue to work towards those goals and those visions and those ideals, and that we do it in partnership together. So thank you for those reflections. I'm really delighted to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Dorothy Bazaway. Dorothy is the convener of the Habitat International Coalition Women and Habitat Africa Working Group Uganda. She is also the executive director of Shelter and Settlements Alternative in Uganda, and is currently the convener of the Urban Informality Working Group in Uganda. So it's really great to have you with us today, Dorothy, and I'll just hand it right over to you. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Lydia. Good day to everyone, mainly because I don't know where everyone is speaking from, but I'm Dorothy Baziwe, and I'm very glad to be here. I'm from Uganda, and I'm currently convening the Women and Habitat Africa Working Group under Habitat International Coalition, but I also work as the Executive Director of Shelter and Settlements in Alternatives in Uganda. And I would just like to take it on from what previous speakers have spoken about, but just to bring some context to the question of women's right to land, adequate housing, and adequate and affordable housing to address homelessness. What are the challenges and gaps that we're finding in Uganda and in our side of the country? As it is known, land is a critical resource for everyone all over the world, everywhere. And you find that in Uganda, we are mainly reliant on land because 80% of our economy is agricultural based, and this means that land is the most critical and important thing to us. So you will find that in Uganda we have challenges that have existed over time, whereby you find that there have been strong cultural norms and traditional practices that do not allow women to inherit land, women to own their homes, women to be able to settle and have access use and control of land as a reproductive source or even as a generator of income. And we also have had challenges where there are existing gender biases, and there's also a lot of dispossession of women's rights. There's evictions, there's loss of resources, and continued gender-based violence, which actually also was very much aggravated during the COVID period, because you find that during the COVID period, issues of housing, most of the women, actually all the women who were experiencing gender-based violence before, had it increased and doubled because they were locked at home with their perpetrators and they had no other way to get out of this, and they had no solution as to where to go or where to run to or support. But I'd like to say that while all this is existing and happening, all is not lost. Uganda has had ever since the Beijing Declaration, Uganda has actually taken it on very seriously and had a lot of impact in terms of mainstreaming gender and ensuring that women are actually brought up to speed and they're allowed to participate and they're allowed to have control over productive assets such as land and housing. You find that right from our constitution, which is 1995. Actually, coincidentally, it is the same year as the Beijing Declaration. Then we have the Land Act. We have a Succession Act that was amended in 2022, which actually is now recognizing the rights of widows to maintain their matrimonial homes, which is the principal residential property for as long as she lives or until she decides to leave. We have progressive laws such as the Penal Code, the Penal Code Act. We have the National Housing Policy. We have the Urban Policy, all which protect the rights and the obligations of women and girls in Uganda. And this has actually helped us a lot as civil society organizations, because as civil society organizations, we come in to make sure that we are able to address the gap between the existing policies and the practices that are on ground. One of the challenges that I would also like to mention is that most of the policies have been written but are on paper. And when it comes to implementation, there's been a lot of communities or leaders doing other things other than implementing the policies as they should be. So some of the strategies that we have seen as stakeholders in the country, we have seen a lot of research and documentation around gender equality and gender equity. We have seen a lot of evidence-based advocacy and more of speaking from action, from evidence that has come out of the community. We as organizations are empowering women and building their capacities. We're unlocking the potential of technology. We're unlocking the potential of partnerships. We are working with them in their communities to be able to reach out to key stakeholders, especially the local governments, but also other stakeholders and organizations that can influence change at a community level as well as a national level. We have increased the number of advocacy campaigns, and this has actually been a very great support when it comes to talking about women's rights to land and housing. The advocacy campaigns are at a community level, at a national level, and at a global level. They seek to unlock women's awareness of their rights, because not knowing your right does not mean that you're actually not entitled to it. So a lot of sensitization has gone into the communities to ensure that they're able to understand and defend their rights. This comes also hand in hand with policy advocacy, because all the policies and the practices in Uganda have been really scrutinized. And we have gone back to the Beijing Declaration. We have tried to unpack, to localize, to ensure that we inculcate all the declarations, recommendations at a local level. How can we ensure that the community has the information, has the capacity, and has also the right linkages to be able to speak for themselves, but to also be able to demand their rights? This has led to community structures such as community advocates or community paralegals, where, for example, my organization is working with community paralegals under a project called Women's Spaces that is looking at promoting women's rights to land, housing, and livelihoods. How can women sustain themselves as a community without actually having to face a lot of violations? This has also supported in terms of the documentation of land claims in Uganda. Uganda as a country has 4 different tenure systems, and some of the tenure systems have been complicated for a while. So you find that as a result of this, women have actually not been able to actively access, use, and control land. Or in cases where they have had access, they do not have control over the proceeds or the resources that come out of the land that they are using for agriculture. You find that in terms of access, when the husband dies or when the partner chases the woman away, she is evicted or she is stripped of her rights and she remains with nothing. She remains homeless. This has actually helped, the Women's Spaces Project has helped to introduce documentation of land claims where women are able to defend their rights to land and also enjoy their right to housing and remain home with a home, a shelter that is adequate for them. Last but not least, because I know I am running steadily out of time, we are looking at supporting women to be able to make functional wills, women working together with their communities to write wills, and to know that, to go away from the culture whereby we think that when we write a will, someone is going to die. So we have increased the practice of writing wills. We've increased the practice of using technology to be able to store such sensitive information and be able to use it adequately as and when it comes up. We have also had issues as a result of the practices that we have been promoting, where women are legalizing their marriages. By sensitizing women and being able to increase their awareness on their rights and what they have to do to enjoy these rights. This has led to women legalizing their marriages and reducing instances of homelessness. Finally, under the Women's Spaces Project, we are seeing women more and more asking for documentation of their land claims so that they can be able to protect their rights and prevent domestic violence, prevent violence against women, and also prevent homelessness. Our call to action is that we need more and more sensitization of women and girls and people living with disabilities in the communities. As a previous speaker said, nothing for us without us. That is also something that we strongly believe in Uganda, in the Women and Habitat Working Group, nothing for us without us. And we believe that the solutions can start from the community and be amplified so that we can work together so as to see socio-economic development all over the world. We also call for the encouragement of referral pathways and linkages and broadening the technological access to unlock the potential of women all over the world, because we know that women are very good communicators. When they get together and they're able to use technology, they can reach far and ensure that our cry is heard all over the world. A key thing that has been talked about that I would also like to stress is while resources are greatly reducing, there is need to encourage partnerships and collaborations, all the way from national campaigns to international campaigns. Let us continuously call for collective voices and social cohesion so that women can be supported and they can fight for their rights and remain away from the challenges of homelessness. Lastly, I also want to encourage the involvement or the engagement of change agents and working with men. One of the things that we have done in the Women's Spaces project is to ensure that we are working with local leaders, both women and men, and making sure that they come to the table together. And once they speak together, they are speaking stronger and defending women's rights to land and housing. I thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Dorothy. That was a really comprehensive overview of all of the different pieces and components as a society works on this, from policy to civil society to advocacy. Just a couple kind of reflections on the topics that you brought up. I was thinking about how domestic violence is a huge driver of women's homelessness, but in many countries, the domestic violence response is completely separate from the housing and homeless services response, and that causes a lot of confusion and inefficiency in connecting women with the housing and services and resources that they need to really be stably housed. You also mentioned in detail how women's right to land is not a guarantee in big parts of the world. We know that is definitely true across Africa. We know it's also true across different portions of Latin America and different portions of Asia as well. And so it's often a topic that is absent from a global conversation on homelessness. So thank you for bringing that to the forefront. And then I was thinking also as well about your comments around policy implementation and how you can have a really beautifully written and crafted policy, but how that policy gets implemented in programs on the ground and the extent to which the governments then fund that policy is often a very very complicated thing to move forward on. And then your comment as well around knowing your rights. We have seen that in these late days here being a really important component of individual advocacy and individual protection and connection to the resources that do exist. So thank you for being with us today and for bringing your perspective from Uganda. I'm really pleased to introduce our final panelist today, Liana Almany. Liana is the Deputy Director and representative to the UN with UNANIMA International. Liana has degrees in international relations, political science, and global studies. She has contributed to research on forced migration and feminist foreign policy, and has published numerous articles. And she also serves as chair of the NGO Committee on Social Development, which has been a really important partner to the working group to end homelessness. So Liana, thank you for being with us today, and over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Lydia, and it's a pleasure to be speaking here today alongside these esteemed colleagues and friends. And as Lydia said, my name is Liana Almany, and today I'm speaking in my capacity as chair of the NGO Committee for Social Development. So the NGO Committee for Social Development is dedicated to placing people at the center of development to eradicate poverty, achieve full employment and decent work for all, and foster social inclusion. These are the 3 pillars of social development as defined by the First World Summit for Social Development in Copenhagen in 1995. The overarching advocacy priorities which underline and drive the NGO CSW69's efforts to actualize these commitments are social justice, promoting inclusive and transformative social policies, economic justice, restructuring global financial systems, environmental justice, protecting human rights and the environment, and political justice, ensuring inclusive governance and participation. We at the NGO CSW69 have long advocated for a human rights-based approach to end homelessness. After all, the structural and circumstantial drivers of homelessness include inequality, poverty, and lack of access to social protection, decent work, healthcare, education, and housing. Today, I was invited to draw attention to a critical issue that exemplifies the intersection of the 3 pillars of social development, the NGO CSW's overarching advocacy priorities, and the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. The widespread exclusion of women from institutions of power and governance, and its direct impact on homelessness among women. This exclusion is not merely a symptom of gender inequality. It is a driving force behind policies and systems that foster gender inequality by perpetuating women's economic vulnerability, lack of housing security, and exposure to gender-based violence and discrimination. Prevailing policies and practices often contribute to social, economic, environmental, and political injustices and fail to address the actual needs of those least able to cope and adapt to shocks. Women and girls face barriers to participation in society, as entrenched gender inequalities decrease women's access to not only resources and support, but also to opportunities for empowerment, resilience building, and decision-making. As my fellow panelists have emphasized today, this contributes to the compounded risk of homelessness for women and girls, the further marginalization of women and girls experiencing homelessness, and the exclusion of women from the decision-making table, making it impossible to break the gendered cycle of marginalization, poverty, and homelessness. The gendered barriers to policymaking and resilience building for women and girls is evidenced and affirmed by their unequal access to employment, education, healthcare, and housing. When women are absent from decision-making tables, policies fail to account for their lived realities and fail to address the root of the vulnerabilities and challenges that women and girls face. Without women's voices to develop and implement policies that are gender sensitive and context specific, the systemic barriers they face remain overlooked, and the cycle of extreme poverty and homelessness continues. So let me give you a few examples of the unique challenges that women and girls face, which my fellow panelists have touched on, and the policies and programs that women have developed to address them. As we know, women are overrepresented in unpaid and informal employment, often denied access to fair wages, social protections, and opportunities for professional growth. This means that women, especially single mothers and women from marginalized communities, often struggle to afford stable and adequate housing. A policy framework which recognizes informal work, compensates for time dedicated to unpaid care work, and empowers more women to find employment in the formal sector, thus provides a holistic model of support which addresses one of the root causes of homelessness for women and girls and empowers them to build their own resilience. In addition, even when the policies and practices of institutions are gender neutral, these gender neutral processes may themselves inherently disadvantage women. The income disparities, less formal income sources, less access to property titling documentation, and other issues rooted in patriarchal traditions and intersectional discrimination make it more difficult for women to meet loan approval requirements for housing, post-secondary education, and business ventures. Financing and policy programs informed by women with lived experience can dismantle social stigmas, respond to women's needs, and break the gendered cycle of poverty and homelessness. These include gender sensitivity training and capacity building for financial institutions, inclusive financial incentives, and increased loan access for female-headed households and women-owned small businesses. The provision of other gender-responsive social protections for women experiencing homelessness, such as healthcare and avenues for legal resource, can also reduce their vulnerability and support their ability to recover from shocks. For example, as Dorothy just mentioned, establishing the physical, psychological, and emotional safety of women through women-led holistic housing programs, which provide trauma-informed care and legal support services, can address the unique needs of women experiencing homelessness due to gender-based violence. In the context of climate change, gender-responsive social protections implemented before disasters occur can reduce the disproportionate number of women and girls displaced by climate impacts and support a just transition. Ultimately, women must be empowered to address the issues most important to their survival and well-being. The question is not whether women should be included, but how we can remove the barriers to their inclusion. As such, gender-responsive policies and programs must go beyond simply responding to gender-specific risks. They require the transformation of the structural constraints and discriminatory social norms that drive inequalities at every level. This begins with the meaningful inclusion of diverse women with lived experience in institutions of power and governance. Gender norms are complex and contextual in nature, and increasingly interconnected social, economic, and environmental issues such as homelessness cannot be resolved without the knowledge and experience of women and girls who understand the specificities of the gendered experience of homelessness because they've lived it. The leadership of women in the development and implementation of policies and programs allows for the bigger picture needed to rebuild trust, shift norms within communities and institutions, and enhance the capacity of states to develop more sustainable, effective, and just systems at every level. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Liana, for bringing some really specific ways for women to be included in a not about us, without us kind of way. Several of our speakers have mentioned that phrase, and I really like the specificity of we need to include women at decision-making tables. Sometimes I see inclusion happening in tokenistic ways, people being asked to tell their stories, but not really being at the tables where those solutions and policies are created. And so again, thank you for that specificity. Okay, so we have just a little, just about 15 minutes for questions and answers and dialogues. There's a couple comments that have come into the chat, which I'll surface. I also have some questions myself, so I might take prerogative as moderator to ask those questions. But for those of you who are listening in and participating, if you do have specific questions that you'd like the speakers to address, please go ahead and put those into either the chat or to the Q&A function. The first question that has come in is a really big one. Can you expand on what you mean by poverty being feminized? And I wonder if, Jean, I can come to you first on that question.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Lydia. Well, there's no doubt about it, but that women are disproportionately affected among, if you like, the poor, and how they become homeless, where men don't have the same disproportionate issues as women. I think that would be very strongly for me. I suppose I was thinking there as you were asking the question and while we were talking about it as well. As you know, I've worked as a practitioner, and a woman I worked with many years ago who was homeless on the street. She was part of the hidden homeless with a child, and went through the system. And one thing she said, I suppose this is one of the things that I think when I hear the feminization of poverty, the only ones who can describe that are the people who go through that system, who go through that experience. And she's now doing her doctorate on the feminization of poverty. And I think that is something we need to wait for, is to get it from those who have the experience, knowing how they're disproportionately affected. So that's my response to it, Lydia.
Thank you, Jean. Dorothy, I wondered if you have insight from Uganda that you could share on poverty being feminized.
Thank you. I think in Uganda, we were doing a study on women's dispossession from land and home. looking at how women are affected when it comes to issues of evictions, homelessness, and displacement. And we realized that at the end of the day, when an eviction happens or a displacement happens, it's mainly the women at home. It's mainly the women who are the caregivers. It's mainly about care. It's mainly about all the aspects of life. The gentleman has gone to work to probably earn a living or to do something, and the woman is home. So you find that when we're talking about poverty having been feminized, we're looking at women being affected by displacement, by evictions, and by homelessness. And that's what it means for us in our case.
Thank you. Oh yeah, Jean, go ahead. I see.
Can I also add to that is the hidden faces of homelessness. And just following up from what Dorothy has just said, that is often the case when we talk about the feminization of poverty. It's hidden poverty, it's hidden homelessness because it's not seen. So oftentimes you will find that women and children particularly are couch surfing. And so it looks like everything is okay, but actually it's not. And that's one of the areas of where feminization of poverty takes place. And that is what this woman is expanding on now from her own experience.
Thank you. We also have another comment in the chat that I'd like to direct to Ambassador Cronin. Our colleague Indu from India is reflecting on how the government is destroying women's rights, particularly in the minority communities, the religious minority communities. And he is saying it's time internationally that these issues of women's equality and the feminization of poverty get addressed. And I'm just wondering if you can share from sort of your perspective there at the UN, what are some opportunities to talk about women's issues globally? What are some of the challenges to it? What would you like to see sort of happen in terms of the member states and the UN and our SDG on gender equity?
Lydia, if I explained what I'd like to see happen in member states in the UN, we'd be here until Christmas of next year. But generally speaking, in kind of broad strokes, I would say that as people will know, there is there are many challenges in the multilateral system, right? At the UN and elsewhere. We know that the winds of change are not blowing in the UN's direction as they need to be, and that's why there is a real effort to seize the moment. And the Pact for the Future last year was about trying to, reform the multilateral system. And despite the challenges that we know we're facing as a multilateral system, to actually find ways and means of progressing agendas, of making real change happen on the ground, supporting member states. Us collectively, we're the only organization with 193 countries around the same table, each having a voice. And so that needs to be protected. The UN Charter is now 80 years. That needs to be protected, celebrated. But we need to find practical ways and means of actually following through on some of the very key issues that we've heard that have been brought up in the Q&A and that people have spoken around the table at. I mentioned at the start that it is very important for us in terms of what sometimes people see as, we're negotiating these resolutions in the basements of the UN overnight and over several weeks and days, and fighting over words and paragraphs. I have an honest belief that those words and paragraphs matter. It's important for us to maintain language, to not allow pushbacks to take effect, to not give up the space at the multilateral level, where we have long-standing agreements, the Beijing Platform being one of them. And so when I say that the feminization of poverty is there in the political declaration, well, that took a lot of work and engagement. And that now enables us, with that banner, with those words, and with our ability to have resolutions that we can now, call member states to account for, including our own, as I said. So I would say, with regards to issues that are raised in India or elsewhere, we have vulnerable groups in Ireland, the traveling community, for example, migrants, refugees. We know very well pastoralists in other countries. So ensuring that we're able to, I guess, for us, the North Star being leave no one behind, reach the furthest behind first. And that's what you're speaking about here this morning. And that's where I think, as a UN and multilateral actors, we really need to listen and keep up the good fight.
Thank you. I see hands up from our panelists, this is always my favorite part of these events, when we get to have the real dialogue together. So I see Jean's hand up, and then Dr. Iffy. So Jean, I'll come to you first, and then we'll go to Dr. Iffy.
So I'm delighted just to respond to Ambassador Cronin. He's so right on everything he said. I want to talk about the work we did on the resolutions, Ambassador. The Working Group to End Homelessness and various organisations really worked together over a 5-year period to get a number of resolutions on homelessness at the UN. And the success of that was the inclusion of civil society, NGOs, all of us in conversation together. And I say this truthfully all the time, we never felt excluded. We always felt, we didn't always agree on some of the interpretations on homelessness, but we agreed to disagree, and we worked well together. And so that's really important, that we understand that countries have these resolutions, that they can go back to their governments and look for, the betterment of the various laws, particularly the law around the provision of housing for people who are out of home.
Thank you, Jean. And over to you, Dr. Iffy.
Yeah, thank you so much. Your Excellency, I want to thank you so much for all that you have said. In fact, you are on point, and other speakers to be there. Just a little thing that I want to add here. The Secretary General of the UN, during one of his meetings in Addis Ababa, did mention that the face of poverty is the face of a woman. And for me, if you look at the internet or the website or the pictures of poverty, whose face do you see there? Normally, it's the woman's face. So, for me, that says it all. In addition to, all that our speakers have said, Dorothy, has also mentioned it, because those of us are the Women and Habitat Africa Working Group who've been, pushing for land rights. So what am I trying to say is that even without going into too much thought, just look at poverty in any picture, in any situation. The face you will see there is the face of a woman and the children. I submit my case. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Iffy. So we just have another couple minutes and a final question in the chat from our colleague Siobhan, talking about stigma and the increasing stigma with people claiming Social Security benefits, with accessing the help that does exist for them. I wonder, Liana, I don't think I've come to you with a question yet. So if you want to take a first response to that, then I'll open that question up to our other panelists as well.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia. I think that the social stigma is really a big part of not only, why women and girls are excluded from the decision-making table, and also, other opportunities for economic opportunities, and from really participating in their societies. But there's also this idea that people experiencing homelessness, it's like their personal fault, and it's something that they've done wrong, rather than really looking at the bigger system, like I mentioned in my remarks, looking at the systems and the really deep-rooted systemic discrimination that keeps people from participating in their societies and also building their own resilience, not needing to rely on services. And I'll also say, we know that in this political context, there's a lot of language used that really kind of dehumanizes people and makes people be seen as less than. And I think that's part of it, this idea that people are stealing from governments, kind of making the most of the social services when they don't really need them. And I think that's something that really rarely happens. And there are these just small instances that are pulled out that then contribute to the social stigmas and will ultimately keep people who really do need those resources from being able to access them, but also from governments being able to kind of develop them properly. And I think that's why it's also really important that governments do recognize that these women and girls have not only unmet needs, but also untapped resources and contribute to building these policies and programs that really do meet their needs through these social services.
Thank you, Leanna. I think that comment around the narrative that we see our politicians using on homelessness really relates to what Ambassador Cronin said before about the language matters, the paragraphs matter, the way that we talk about these issues matters, because it can create stigma, or it can bring the stigma. It can lower the stigma. So any other quick responses from our other panelists as we're coming to the close here? Anyone else want to weigh in on the stigma question?
Yeah, I'll
Please.
just come in and thanks, Siobhan, for the question, and great to see your participation online. But I think it's a very valid question. It is something that we need to be very conscious of, both in terms of language, but also in terms of policies, and how we convert language into policies, or how we look at response mechanisms. So getting away from what some people call this shame poverty nexus, which historically has been an issue. Social protection or any supports, in terms of seeing, I suppose, people as passive recipients, or are not, working hard enough, or it's their own fault. And I've seen this in developing countries, in middle income countries. I've seen it, and it is there in developed countries. And that is the importance, therefore, of making sure that there is good communication, that there is strong policy in place, that people are treated with respect and dignity, that underlying factors are properly understood. Those factors, be it of homelessness, or deprivation, or other vulnerability. Because the last thing that we need is for those who need services and access to those services to feel in some way reticent or unsure. We had a meeting on vision and sight, and blindness, and the huge impact it's having across many countries in the global south, in Africa and elsewhere. And some communities are even not willing to, or afraid to admit that they're not seeing properly, and there's stigma around that. So HIV/AIDS, we've had decades of dealing with stigma around HIV/AIDS, and finding ways and means of empowering people. And I think that's one of the key messages that I've taken from the other speakers, that empowerment needs to happen at the grassroots, at the national level, for sure. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll go to Jean, and then to Dorothy, and then we'll conclude our time together. Jean?
So I just want to continue after the ambassador, because there's a lot of wisdom in what you're saying. One of the things that strikes me is that all systems need to work together and for each other, because if we're working in silos, then we will get this area of stigma. And the other thing I want to say is that we need to work with women as well in relation to politicization in order to understand the systems that are around and the rights that people have. And one of the final things is that homelessness is not a life sentence. It doesn't go on forever. So we have to see it as, you know, part of a journey, particularly for women, children, and girls.
Thank you, Jean. Dorothy, any final thoughts on stigma?
Yes, I thank the previous presenters. They have spoken well about this issue. I just want to emphasize the community structures. Community woman being a support structure for her neighbor is very important. It's one of the things that helps us to actually deal with issues of gender-based violence, deal with issues of stigma, deal with issues of exclusion of people in the community. So I really, really would recommend putting a lot of importance in partnerships all the way from the grassroots to whichever level that we want to work with. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, huge thanks to all our panelists and participants for being here with us today. I am going to hand the floor over to my colleague, Tiffany Connolly, who's the program coordinator for IGH and an active member of the working group to end homelessness, to close out our time today. Tiffany?
Thank you, Lydia. Huge thank you to our panelists for taking the time to be here today and sharing your expertise and your insights. Thank you for everyone who attended today. Please visit our website for access to the recording of this event, as well as recordings of previous events. And also, if you're interested in joining the working group, please visit our membership page on our website. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. We'll send around an email to all attendees too with the links to the website and everything. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.